Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Good. How you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Okay, everyone, a few more minutes and we'll jump in. Just a few more names jumping on. So let me just give everyone a couple more minutes and we'll get started. All right. Let's jump in. So welcome to our June learning session for PWDC Phase 2. Today, we're going to be talking about whether to adopt, adapt, or abandon your change strategy. And we have some slides to walk you through that. Our famous Luis Gonzalez is going to walk you through a little bit of how to decide how to proceed. But let me start first with our acknowledgement and disclaimer. So the Emergency Medical Services for Children Innovation and Improvement Center is supported by the Health Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, as part of an award totaling $3 million with 0% financed with non-governmental sources. The contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by HRSA, HHS, or the U.S. government. And for more information, please visit hrsa.gov. So as I was saying, today's agenda, we're going to briefly talk about when to adopt, when to adapt, when to abandon. And then we will go into breakout sessions where we'll talk a little bit through your projects for those of you that are there on whether you're ready to decide whether you want to adopt a change strategy, adapt it, or abandon it and try something new. But it's okay if you're not. We want everyone to just share your project. We're here to help you work through it as a group, give you insight, give you feedback, and really help ensure that you're being successful in your project. So that'll happen in the breakout sessions. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's coming up next, which is we only have one more group session, which is we're going to talk about kind of reflecting on your progress and then developing a plan for sustainability. And then a few housekeeping and reminder items, and we will set you free. So with that, we wanted to kind of jump in first, getting a little bit of an assessment on where you all are with your project and what phases you're in and if you need some more help. So here's a couple of polling questions for you just to give us kind of an idea of where you are. If I put this up here, you guys can see the answers. I don't see any responses. Are there no, do you guys see the polling?
Yeah, I see them.
Okay, okay, good. Oh, there they go, okay. Let's give it about another minute. Oh, Tanya, you can't submit a response to the poll. Interesting. I don't know why. But you can use the chat box if you'd like to. I'm fine with that. Okay, I'll go ahead and end the poll. I think I can share the results. So, oops, I can't move this over. Okay, so here's kind of the results. So it looks like most of you are progressing through your project, and that's so exciting to see. So some of you were kind of just planning your first test of change, totally fine. Some are working on implementing, and a few have kind of completed their testing of their first test of change and deciding what to do next. So you're right where we need you to be for this talk. And that's fantastic, but I want to reiterate that you don't have to be here yet. We realize this takes more time than kind of the accelerated approach that we're taking a little bit with this collaborative right now. Most of you don't think you need more coaching, also phenomenal. As a reminder, and I'll have them at the end of the slides today, we have a few more coaching sessions where you're welcome to come get one-on-one feedback and help from us. I would say a slight majority have everything you need to implement your project. And if not, the next majority kind of know what you need to get, and some are lacking the resources. So fabulous. Okay, so thank you for letting us kind of give an idea where you are. It helps us kind of orient the talk for today and to try to meet you all where you are with your project. So that's wonderful. Thank you. So with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Lewis, who's going to talk a little bit how you think through whether to adapt, adopt, or abandon.
Thanks, Meredith, and thanks again, everyone, for joining. What we're going to do in these just a few brief minutes is kind of walk through a process of making the decision about next steps. And so while we talk about it as adopt, abandon, or adapt, there's some little nuances we want to talk about to help you with making that decision. For those of you who are there, to be able to make that decision now. Those of you who aren't quite there, to be able to kind of help you with that once you get to that particular point. So let's start with a little bit of refresher. As you've seen several times before, the IHI model is what we use for improvement. And this graphic just kind of is a good reminder for us. Hopefully by now, all of you have been through, at least from the poll, it looks like everyone's at least been through these first 3 questions, and you've at least selected a specific change. That change becomes what we then call a PDSA cycle, or our first PDSA cycle, using the first change strategy. And as you may recall, the change strategy is what specific change you'll put into place in order to get the results that you outline in your aim statement. So the aim statement's going to be real critical, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But one thing to take note of in this graphic is notice that where the PDSA cycle is at the bottom of the graphic, to the left and right of it are these arrows, and those arrows are intended to remind us that this is an iterative process, that we implement a specific PDSA cycle using a specific change strategy. And then we see how it worked. And that's in the A part, or in the study part, where we study the results, and then we act based on the results of that. And that's what we're going to kind of walk through is in a second, is how to walk through those results, and how do I determine, whether I make a change or what do I do. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Meredith. So this graphic you've seen before, and this is a reminder that what we're going to be doing really today in your breakout sessions is to really kind of focus on some discussion, and we'll be doing more than this, but when you get to using the information I'm going to go over in the next slide, we're only focused right now on our first PDSA cycle, which is really what that first change strategy is, that change that you implemented. And when we implement it, we call that a PDSA cycle, where I planned some specific change, I implemented that specific change, that's the do part. And then at the end of that, you study that to see, well, what did it tell me? What were the results? What did it tell me that I didn't anticipate? And those kind of things. But we're only going to focus on the first PDSA cycle in order to determine what do I do next following the first PDSA cycle. So that's the next couple slides that I'm going to show you. Just keep that in mind, that we're referring to the first PDSA cycle, not your overall improvement project, but just that first cycle. And so in today's session, especially in the next few minutes, just kind of think about in your mind, keep thinking about your first PDSA cycle, your first change strategy. Think about that, especially if you've completed it. Definitely think about that because you're at that decision point now. And again, keep in mind that's your first change strategy. So next slide. What we came up with, and our team put this together, and we basically wanted to create a tool for you to help guide you through that decision process of do I need to adopt this change strategy, this first PDSA cycle that I just completed, whenever you do complete it? Do I adapt it, meaning modify it somewhat, but use a piece of it? Or do I just not do it at all? That's the abandon part. In making that decision, it's important to kind of follow a process. So the first thing that we would suggest to you is always start with the aim statement in mind. If what it takes is to write down your aim statement and put it in front of you as you're going through this algorithm, then do that, because the aim statement's the starting point. And the aim statement helps us to make decisions about how well did we do, because the aim statement describes what we sought to accomplish. So the objective of this process we're going to run you through is to determine how well, and that's the key, is how well did your first change strategy, as evidenced by your first PDSA cycle, how well did you actually meet your aim statement? So use your aim statement, or using your aim statement, then look at what improvement you saw, if any. And to look at that, you have to think about what's the measure and what are measures, and what were the results of those measures based on your first PDSA cycle. Whenever you're finished with your first PDSA cycle, that's what you want to do as part of the S, which is the study part. So study those results you got, compare them to your aim statement. And then this algorithm is really kind of designed to kind of walk you through what are the possibilities. So let's just kind of walk through them real briefly. Let's start off with, what if your first PDSA cycle, this first change strategy that you implemented, resulted in you completely meeting your aim statement, and there were no negative consequences? I know that's a double negative, but there was an absence of negative consequences. Then we'd say that first change strategy, that first PDSA cycle, was a complete success. Now, that's possible. It's often not the case that the very first change strategy, the very first PDSA cycle, got you completely on board with your aim statement. It is possible, and it's great if you have that, but it really depends on how complex or how challenging your aim statement really was, and whether that first cycle is really going to do that. The intention of the model, the intention of QI, is it typically takes multiple iterative processes, multiple PDSA cycles, to actually get to where you want to be. So let's just kind of think about an example. And one of those examples would be, say, let's say, for example, your aim statement was, we want to have 95%, by X date, we want to have 95% of our staff demonstrating competency in pediatric competency A. And when you finished your first PDSA cycle, your first change strategy, your results were 98% of your staff demonstrated competency in pediatric competency A. Your aim was 95, you got 98. Well, in this case, not only did you meet your aim statement, you really met it so well that there's really not a whole lot of room for additional improvement. To go from 98% to 100%, that's pretty tough. And that's almost aiming for perfection, which is probably not a good thing to do. But this is an example of where it's kind of a duh. Of course, you would adopt this change strategy because it had no negative consequences and you met your aim statement, and there's really not much more room for improvement. So sure, let's do this. But you could say maybe a slightly different approach to that might be, what if your aim statement was 80% of the staff demonstrate competency in pediatric competency A, and at the end of your PDSA cycle, you had 85% met. Well, you met your aim statement because it was 80% and you got 85%. You met that. But now the question is, did you really get the improvement that you need, and more importantly, that our pediatric patients really need? Or is there still room for improvement? Maybe your aim statement was a little low. Your 80% was, you're being conservative and starting low, which is okay. And so it may be an indicator that another PDSA cycle, a second one, could get you from that 85% to something further, like maybe that's 95% or something like that, rather than 80%. So you have to think about these kinds of things when you think about what's real success. It's not just meeting the number, it's really getting the improvement that we want in the services that we provide in terms of the pediatric emergency care or anything related to that. So that's the complete one. That's the easy one where yes, let's adopt that one. Well, sometimes we didn't quite meet the aim statement, but we got some improvement, or maybe we had some negative consequences. And if that were the case, then this is an example where looking at your results would be, you'd have to say, well, maybe if we modified our change strategy number one, our PDSA cycle number one, if we modified that some, then maybe we could get closer to our aim statement or exceed our aim statement or have further improvement. And if that's the case, then you might modify your change strategy, your PDSA cycle. For your second one, you would use a modified version of change strategy number one. Now you're at a modified one, that becomes change strategy number two, PDSA cycle number two. And that's what you would implement based on what you learned or what you're aiming for, what you learned from the first one, what you're aiming for as a result of this whole quality improvement effort. Then you go through a second cycle, a second PDSA cycle. And this is really more common, that you would go through 2 or 3 or more iterative cycles of PDSA cycles in order to get the improvement that you want. Because it's not always quite as easy as we think, unless we set our bar really, really low. So one possibility is that you find out, we didn't quite meet it, but we get some improvement, just not where we wanted to be. Or we may have had some negative consequences. With the negative consequences, you have to think about the same things that I said earlier, which were how significant are those negative consequences? If those negative consequences are things like, well, it increased the workload of staff a little bit, well, then you have to think about that, well, how significant was it? Is that a real big issue? Is it something we can kind of mitigate? We can make it to where it doesn't hurt too much. Then that would be one approach. But if those negative consequences are, well, we got improvement with some patients, but we harmed others. Well, that's not a real tolerable negative consequence. So that may mean that change strategy, while it gave you improvement, it harmed someone in the process, in which case that may not be a good change strategy to even modify. It may be you need to go to a new change strategy for cycle number 2. In addition, and so that's where you would maybe adapt one. Instead of just totally adopting it, you would adapt it maybe. But if you can't adapt it because of these negative consequences, maybe then you need to just say, okay, that one didn't work, and maybe we'll go with a brand new change strategy for PDSA cycle number 2. And again, that's not uncommon, that your first approach, your first PDSA cycle really didn't get you near the mark of what you sought in your aim statement. So don't feel bad if that happens. It does happen. I've been there and tried things that I thought would work in the first PDSA cycle, and it failed. And so you go to something different for your second PDSA cycle. The third possibility is the right-hand side of your screen, which is the PDSA cycle didn't give you any improvement and all you got were negative consequences. Well, that's problematic, because that means you didn't get any improvement and all you got were things that were actually not necessarily harmful, but they were certainly harmful to your quality improvement effort. they could have been really harmful, like I used as an example earlier, where they harmed people. Well, that's an easy one. That would be abandon that. If that's all you got. If you got no improvement and only negative, that's a pretty simple one of saying, unless you can clearly find a way to say there's ways we can maybe address this lack of improvement or these negative consequences, that's an abandon. That's a start with creating a second change strategy that's totally different, or at least different, because this one didn't work and it potentially harmed people. So that's an abandon. So I didn't go through all of the different iterations, but you can see that the idea is some key questions are about, is it realistic and sustainable? Is it hitting your aim statement? Are there negative consequences? And if so, are those consequences things you can mitigate, or are they consequences that you just can't tolerate? And in which case, that's not a good change strategy. And then that's where the adopt, adapt, or abandon come in, is using this algorithm to help guide you into that. But again, all of this is about PDSA cycle number 1. Should I adopt this PDSA cycle number 1, which doesn't mean I can't have PDSA cycle number 2. And maybe I just adapt it and then do PDSA cycle number 2. Or I abandon PDSA cycle number 1 and create a new PDSA cycle number 2. Everything we're talking about here is about making the decision about what do I do after PDSA cycle number 1. Meredith, if you could go to the second or the next slide. And so that's those 3 areas we just talked about. And all of them lead to the same point, which is once you get to this stage where you finish PDSA cycle number 1, you've made a decision using that algorithm as a guide of, should I adopt, adapt, or abandon my change strategy number 1? Your next steps are to start planning your next PDSA cycle, which would be, in this case, PDSA cycle number 2. And so your focus then shifts to, well, what should I do based on your decision you just reached, using this algorithm as a good guide for PDSA cycle number 2, to, again, not just meet your aim statement, but get to the improvement that you really sought after. And in some cases, it's pretty straightforward. Some cases, it isn't, and it takes 2 or 3 or more PDSA cycles. So there's a reason we show in this graphic 4 PDSA cycles and that is because typically 2 or 3, maybe a little bit more, not unusual. What's unusual is a single one, because you knock it out of the ballpark on the very first one. That's great. If your aim statement was pretty simple, like some of you used structural kind of components, like just formalizing the PEC role within your institution, then your first change strategy might be pretty straightforward and pretty easy to hit. But then your second part of that might be furthering engagement, furthering reach and engagement among your staff. Then those are new quality improvement efforts, and those may be a little harder and take 2 or 3 iterations to get through. So what we want to do, for those of you who, as Meredith said, our breakout sessions will have 2 parts or kind of different things. Part of it might be just reporting where you are now. Those of you who've completed that, that's awesome. If you completed your first PDSA cycle, and we'd love to hear and walk through, just as an example, walk through the algorithm with you to kind of say, help guide you in your next steps for your PDSA cycles. So that's all I have. If there are questions, I haven't been looking at the chat box, but if there are questions, we can certainly go through those.
You did. So I'm gonna launch one last question. So now that Lewis has kind of walked through in general where you might go as far as adopt, adapt, or abandon, I'm curious kind of where you all are. And while we're running this question and giving you some time to answer, are there questions for Lewis or myself or any of the rest of our team on this concept or really how you go about it? I can go back to the previous one. Oops. To kind of give you a more glimpse. You can use the chat box. You can come off mute and ask a question if you'd like.
If you don't mind, I was just going to add another little comment to what Lewis was saying. Sometimes you get change and it was unintended change and it's good change. So maybe it didn't change what you were going for, but it did make an improvement of something else. You would still want to adopt that. Say you made a modification to a process and inadvertently it increased your patient satisfaction scores. So that's wonderful. So you want to keep doing that. But you need to go back and tweak and look at that next cycle to see what it is you need to do to impact the aim that you were initially focusing on.
Oh, thanks, Tracy. All right, so it looks like, let me close this and share it with you all. It looks like, I don't know if you guys can see this when I put this up, sometimes you can. Those of you who are here, you're either adapting or adopting, nobody's abandoning, and I think that's very encouraging. So that's exciting to see. If you are still deciding, and there's some of you aren't here yet, and that's totally fine. But it's great to see. So I didn't.
Meredith, if I could add just one point, and it's great to see this poll, and I appreciate everyone's input. Those who responded with adapt or adopt, that's great. It would be awesome, and the whole purpose of a collaborative for quality improvement is to share experiences and learn from each other. So we would love to learn how yours went, those of you who made a decision about adapt or adopt, to just kind of help everyone else learn from your experiences. Not to criticize, just to be able to learn, because we all learn from each other. So it would be awesome if some of you could share some of your experiences in their breakout sessions.
Yes, please. Thanks, Liz. Let me get rid of this. And let's go to the breakout sessions then, unless there's any questions as a group. We get there. So today we're only going to have 3 breakout rooms. The first 2 are going to be mixed, pre-hospital and hospital. So we're really trying to promote sort of this collaboration and an understanding across the whole continuum of care. And so we thought for this learning session, we would mix you together. You're still gonna be able to choose. So pick 1 or pick 2. I have pre-assigned the room moderators, and most of you that I know from the EMSC programs, you've been pre-assigned to that room. But let me open all the rooms, and you should be able to go into the rooms. Lewis, I wasn't allowed, I couldn't pre-assign you because you're a co-host. I think you have to choose
Okay.
to go into your room. And then the rest of y'all. And please let me know if you don't see an option to choose a room, and I can add you to one. Oh, sorry, you said yours is wait to be assigned. Okay, interesting. I don't know why it works for some and not for others. I have no idea. There you go. The rest of you. I'm just gonna randomize you guys to the rooms.